Atlanta, spring 2023. A funeral with a price tag. The jasmine in Grandma Ruth's backyard was blooming, soft and fragrant, just like it did every spring. But the scent couldn't cover up the bitterness in the air. The house was full, cluttered not with love or shared memories, but with folding chairs, oversweet punch, and people who hadn't visited Ruth in years. The urn sat quietly on the side table, a cardboard cylinder with a printed label. No flowers around it. Just a framed picture of Ruth in her church dress, smiling like she knew this whole thing would be a mess. Maggie stood near the sliding glass door, hands clenched, face unreadable. She was wearing black not out of grief but because anything else felt wrong. People greeted her with awkward hugs and insincere condolences. Cousin Susan whispered something about the chicken salad being too dry. Lyle was already complaining about the parking. Donna, in her stiff church hat, was busy counting how many people took a second slice of cake. Nobody looked at the urn for more than a few seconds. Maggie kept her distance. She had been the one to call the funeral home. The one who cleaned out Ruth's fridge and picked out the photo for the table. She sat alone with Ruth's body at the crematorium. And now here she was again, alone, surrounded by family. "Don't forget who raised you," muttered Aunt Celeste loud enough for Maggie to hear. She was standing by the kitchen, holding a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, eyes darting between Maggie and the living room. "That woman did everything for you. She wasn't your real mama, but close enough. You weren't even her real blood," added Lyle later, while chewing on a deviled egg. "But she took you in. That's gotta count for something." Maggie said nothing. She didn't flinch. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. These were familiar lines. Echoes of childhood. "Be grateful," they'd said when she was 12 and had to mop floors after school. "Be quiet," they'd say when she asked about her mother. "You owe everything to Ruth," was the refrain that shaped her life. The living room was stifling. Sunlight bounced off plastic-covered cushions, the AC unit rattled, and someone had spilled punch on the rug. Maggie stared at the stain. It was shaped like a question mark. A man in a navy blazer stood quietly near the hallway, Mr. Crawford, the notary. He held a sleek black folder and a plain white envelope. Maggie had called him 3 weeks ago, after Ruth's final hospital visit. Ruth had insisted on seeing him. "For my affairs," she'd whispered. It was the only time Maggie had seen her that clear-minded in months. Now Mr. Crawford stood stiffly, scanning the room. He made eye contact with Maggie but didn't move. The envelope in his hands looked heavier than paper should be. It was sealed, with Maggie's name written in careful handwriting across the front. Someone bumped into the urn. It rocked slightly but no one noticed. Not even Susan, who was too busy talking about probate court and whether that old place could fetch anything decent on the market. Maggie clenched her hands tighter. Her nails left red crescents in her palms. The scent of jasmine mixed with cheap perfume and grocery store cologne. Maggie felt dizzy. This house, Ruth's house, used to smell like warm biscuits and hand lotion. Now it smelled like finality and greed. Donna started talking about splitting things fairly. She hadn't visited Ruth in over 4 years. Lyle mentioned something about Ruth wanting the family to stay together, as if he hadn't ghosted Christmas for a decade. Even Celeste was eyeing the hallway, probably wondering what was in the will. Maggie knew exactly what they were doing. Every gesture, every word, they weren't mourning. They were circling. Like vultures with casseroles. No one asked Maggie how she was holding up. No one asked what Ruth's last days had been like. Nobody even thanked her for organizing the funeral. They just wanted to know one thing: who got the house. The notary stepped forward finally. Cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, voice polite but firm, "Mrs. Ruth McMillan requested that I meet privately with Ms. Margaret Allen before any further announcements are made." The room tensed. Maggie nodded silently. Took the envelope from his hands. Felt the weight of it. Something inside it wasn't paper. It was history. Behind her, Celeste scoffed. "I told y'all," she whispered. "This girl's about to walk out of here with what don't belong to her." Maggie walked down the hall without saying a word. But inside something was shifting. Something old and rusted was beginning to loosen. Because for the first time, it wasn't just about what Ruth left behind, it was about who she had been. And maybe, just maybe, who Maggie had always been without even knowing it. The envelope sat unopened for days. Maggie kept it tucked between cookbooks on the kitchen shelf, between Ruth's old red Betty Crocker binder and a faded church fundraiser recipe book from 1982. She wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. Because the moment she did, something irreversible would happen. Not just with the house or the money, but with the story she'd carried all her life. And that story had deep roots. Maggie's childhood wasn't cruel exactly. Just cold. Grandma Ruth was a woman of tight routines and tighter budgets. Her world was lined with coupons, plastic tablecloths, and a constant hum of judgment. "Don't waste electricity," she'd snap if Maggie left a light on. "You think money grows on trees?" was practically the house motto. The air always smelled of canned soup and lemon pledge. Every corner was neat, but nothing ever felt warm. Grandpa Clyde was quieter. He didn't say much. He just sat in his recliner with a cup of black coffee, his gaze fixed on the nightly news. He rarely smiled. If he hugged Maggie, she couldn't remember it. He worked until his back gave out, then sat and watched his life from the sidelines. He died when she was 15 and no one really cried. From the time Maggie could reach the cash register, she was helping out at Ruth's tiny produce shop at the edge of town. She shelved peaches, swept the concrete floor, and counted quarters until her fingers were black with coin dust. Ruth paid her in stale donuts and scoldings. "You eat like you don't have any manners," she once hissed when Maggie dared to bite into an apple before paying. "You owe us better than this." Those words, "you owe us," were a constant undertone in Maggie's life. When she brought home a B+ in geometry, when she forgot to iron her church dress, when she stayed after school to join the yearbook club instead of coming straight home. Every good thing she tried to reach for came with a reminder. You were taken in. You were fed. Don't forget where you came from. Maggie did try. She got into a local community college. Commuted by bus, then by bike when the car broke down and Ruth refused to pay for repairs. "Education's fine, but don't get too high and mighty," Ruth had warned her. "You got work to do here." When Maggie landed her first job, part-time receptionist at a vet clinic, she brought home her first paycheck with pride. Ruth took it straight out of her hands and said, "Good, that'll cover the property tax. You can finally pull your weight." The first boy Maggie brought home didn't last long. David, a shy, tall guy who played acoustic guitar and wanted to teach literature. Ruth hated him instantly. Called him soft. Said he was too pale and too polite. What's he hiding? He lasted 3 weeks before Maggie came home one day and found him sitting on the porch with his backpack. "Your grandma told me I wasn't welcome," he said. He never called again. Looking back, Maggie realized she had never been treated like a daughter, not really. More like a permanent tenant with no lease. Ruth introduced her to others as, "My Maggie," but the tone always had a flicker of something else. Pride laced with control, affection laced with obligation. Maggie wasn't quite family but not quite free either. She lived under a roof built on silence and unsaid debts. And now the roof belonged to her. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe that envelope said otherwise. Maybe it held more chains, or maybe, finally, a key. It was 2 weeks after the funeral when the call came. Mr. Crawford, the notary, politely informed the family that they were all invited to his office downtown. He said the contents of Ruth's official last will and testament would be reviewed there. Maggie could hear the unspoken tension in his voice, like he already anticipated trouble. Susan texted in a group chat immediately, "Let's hope Granny didn't lose her mind and do something foolish." Lyle responded with a winking emoji and a gif of a vault opening. Donna simply wrote, "We'll see." Maggie didn't reply. But her hands trembled a little as she put her phone down. Because somewhere deep in her gut she felt it, the shift. Like a storm gathering in the air before the first drop falls. She didn't know what was in the will. But she knew one thing for sure. Whatever was written in that document, it was going to change everything. The room inside Mr. Crawford's office smelled faintly of old carpet and fresh toner. A long mahogany table stretched through the center, polished to a shine that made it hard to look at under the fluorescent lights. The family filed in with stiff smiles and polite nods, like actors in a courtroom drama, each one hoping for a starring role. Maggie sat at the end of the table, hands folded, a leather bag at her feet. Her heart thudded low and steady, like a warning drum in the distance. Mr. Crawford cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. He began to read. The legal language was cold and unceremonious, but every syllable cut deeper than the last. Ruth McMillan, being of sound mind and judgment, hereby bequeathed her residential home, all personal savings and her 42% share of McMillan Farm Supply and Company to Margaret Allen, sole beneficiary. There was a pause, but not a peaceful one. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a pot boils over. Donna shifted in her seat. Lyle scoffed. Susan blinked like she hadn't heard correctly. Then came the eruption. "This is ridiculous," Susan snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She wasn't even blood. She lived there, sure, but Ruth had other family. Real family. "I don't believe this for a second," Lyle barked. Ruth must have been confused. That girl manipulated her. Took advantage. Probably pushed her to write it when she was sick. Maggie didn't move. She knew they would say all this. She had rehearsed this scene in her head 100 times. She was the taken-in one, the outsider inside. They had always spoken about her like a charity project with an expiration date. No matter how many chores she did, how many holidays she hosted, how many times she sat beside Ruth's hospital bed, none of it ever counted. She was a tenant, not family, Donna added, shaking her head. This whole thing stinks. She doesn't deserve that house. She doesn't even have the McMillan name. Maggie slowly bent down, opened her bag and pulled out an old yellowed envelope. She laid it gently on the table. The handwriting on the front was faded but clear, for Margaret. When it's time. Inside was a certified copy of her birth certificate. Mr. Crawford took it, adjusted his glasses again and read it aloud. The room stiffened. In the section labeled Mother, it read, Ruth Ellen McMillan. Gasps and then more outrage. Susan shouted that it had to be forged. Lyle demanded proof. Donna nearly dropped her phone. But Maggie sat still, her face unreadable, as if she'd been carrying the weight of this paper her entire life, and now she'd finally laid it down. She remembered the night Ruth told her. It was a year ago, maybe a little more. Maggie had just finished cleaning up after dinner. Ruth was sitting at the kitchen table in her housecoat, her eyes tired but sharp. She told Maggie to sit. And then, after a long pause, she simply said, "You're not my granddaughter." Maggie thought it was a joke at first. Ruth had a dark sense of humor when she was in pain. But then Ruth pulled out the envelope, the same one now on the table, and slid it across. "I was 20 when I had you," she'd said. "Your father was a teacher. He left the moment he found out. The school fired me. My church group asked me to leave. I had no job, no support. My parents, your great-grandparents, were so ashamed they refused to let me raise you as mine. Said we'd say you were their grandchild. It would save face." Maggie remembered how her hands had trembled as she opened the paper. How her throat felt like it was closing. Ruth sat there silently, waiting for anger, for judgment. But Maggie had felt nothing but clarity. A strange understanding of all the years of distance, the coldness, the strict rules. Not hatred. Just fear hidden under duty. "I tried," Ruth had whispered. "Lord knows I tried. I didn't know how to be your mother after pretending not to be for so long." And now here Maggie sat, in a notary's office, with every eye on her and the truth laid bare on the table. She didn't respond to their accusations. Didn't cry. Didn't gloat. The truth was enough. Mr. Crawford leaned forward, voice calm but final. "Everything is in order. The will is valid. The documents are authenticated. Maggie is, by legal and biological right, the sole heir." Outside, the Atlanta sun burned bright against the windows. Inside, the family seethed in silence, their plans unraveling. But Maggie, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Not victory. Not relief. Just the quiet weight of finally knowing exactly who she was. And for once, the paper agreed. The day after the will reading, Maggie woke to a voicemail from a blocked number. Then another. And another. Messages ranged from awkwardly polite to borderline threatening. Susan called the will a tragic mistake. Lyle used the word fraud. Donna suggested it would be in everyone's best interest if Maggie stepped back and let the family settle this. But Maggie didn't reply. She just sat at the kitchen table with Ruth's old coffee mug in her hand, staring at the legal envelope now folded and creased on the counter. The lawsuit came less than 2 weeks later. Lyle and Donna filed jointly. Susan joined in as a concerned party. Their lawyer claimed Ruth had been mentally unfit when she wrote the will. They alleged undue influence, manipulation, forgery. Maggie was named as a primary respondent and accused of exploiting a vulnerable senior for personal gain. The complaint was 15 pages long, filled with half-truths and exaggerated timelines. But the accusation that stung most? Margaret Allen is not a rightful heir. The irony was cruel. Maggie had spent her whole life in that house, taking care of the woman who turned out to be her mother. And now she was being painted as some calculating stranger who crept in and stole it all. So she did something unexpected. She fought back. Maggie hired an attorney, a quiet, sharp man named Carlos Ramirez. He had the patience of a monk and the focus of a surgeon. He didn't ask her if she was ready. He didn't ask her if she was scared. He just said, "We'll handle it." Carlos began digging. And what he found was a goldmine of hypocrisy. Bank statements, notarized transfers, medical directives, even handwriting samples. The kind of paper trail no one expected Maggie to have. Ruth had kept everything. Stacks of check stubs, letters, receipts. Records of every time Susan borrowed money from Ruth's account to cover her son's tuition. Signed checks that Lyle cashed for farm maintenance that was never done. Donna's name on a wire transfer used to make a down payment on a condo in Nashville. And buried in a manila folder, a forged permission slip granting Lyle temporary control of Ruth's rural land lot, land he'd mortgaged 3 years earlier. On paper, Ruth owned it. But Lyle had used her signature to get a loan, and now the bank was calling. Maggie watched as Carlos laid it all out in front of the judge. Each document was a nail, each lie exposed a hammer. The more the family protested, the deeper they sank. Their expressions shifted from righteous to rattled. By the third court date, Donna stopped showing up. By the fourth, Susan tried to negotiate. Maggie refused. She wasn't here to settle. She was here to finish. When Lyle was forced to admit under oath that he had faked Ruth's approval for the land deal, the courtroom dropped into silence. His lawyer turned pale. The judge looked tired. Maggie sat still, her hands folded, expression calm. For the first time she was exactly where she belonged, not in the shadows of the family, not in the background of their decisions, but front and center, holding the truth. Carlos filed a countersuit for defamation, requesting damages and legal fees. Maggie didn't want the money. She just wanted the record to be corrected. 3 months later, the court ruled in her favor. The will stood. The accusations were dismissed. Lyle was referred to the district attorney's office for further investigation. Maggie was declared the sole legal heir to Ruth's estate, as originally intended. The headlines didn't run her story. There were no applause, no front-page justice. But Maggie didn't need it. She went home, back to the house with the jasmine out front and the photo of Ruth still standing on the living room shelf. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat in the same chair Ruth had used for decades, and looked out the window. The house was quiet now, not in a haunted way, but in a way that finally felt earned. Not imposed. Not controlled. She had defended her place not just in the will, but in the family history that had tried for years to edit her out. For the first time in her life, Maggie wasn't surviving someone else's decisions. She had made her own. And the silence that filled the house that afternoon wasn't loneliness. It was freedom. A month passed. Spring had turned into the thick warmth of early summer, and the scent of jasmine outside the front window was heavier now, almost too sweet. Maggie lived alone in Ruth's house, her house now, though it still felt strange to call it that out loud. She'd started painting the kitchen cabinets a pale blue, taken down the faded curtains in the living room, and packed away the lace doilies that had covered every surface for decades. The house was quieter now. No visitors, no arguments, no lingering smells of menthol ointment or old pot roast. Just Maggie, her thoughts, and the slow, steady rhythm of making a place feel new again. She didn't change everything. Some things she couldn't. The photo of Ruth remained on the shelf by the fireplace, Ruth in her Sunday best, a smile that now looked more complicated than Maggie had once believed. She'd moved the photo to a new frame, something simple and clean. She no longer saw Grandma in that face. She saw the young, frightened woman Ruth had once been. A woman who had chosen silence over truth, shame over risk. Maggie didn't blame her anymore. While cleaning out the back bedroom closet, Maggie found a shoebox taped shut and buried beneath old holiday decorations. Inside were letters, some finished, others half-written, all addressed to her. None had been sent. One had a tear stain on the edge, the ink slightly smudged. They were written over the span of years, and each one tried in its own way to say what Ruth had never said out loud. That she had been scared. That she'd wanted to protect Maggie but didn't know how. That every sharp word had been a mask for guilt she couldn't shake. Reading them didn't make everything okay. But it made everything clearer. Ruth had lived in fear of judgment, of rejection, of losing what little family she had left. So she chose the story others wanted her to tell. But in those letters, Maggie saw something deeper than fear. She saw love, misshapen and clumsy but real. A legacy not of wealth or property, but of finally facing the truth. One afternoon the phone rang. It was Susan. Her voice was unusually soft. She said she was having a tough time. Financial trouble. Trouble at home. She hinted, without saying the words, that maybe she could stay for a while. Just until she figured things out. Maggie listened, said nothing for a long time and finally replied, "I think you should talk to your lawyer." Then she hung up. There was no satisfaction in it. No triumph. Just a sense of peace, like closing the last page of a long, bitter book. That evening, Maggie sat on the front porch in a wicker chair she had repainted white. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass. The sun was setting behind the tall pines, painting the sky in shades of honey and rose. The house looked almost new now, less like Ruth's shadow and more like Maggie's future. A small boy from down the street wandered up the path. He had a baseball cap too big for his head and a popsicle stick in his hand. He looked up at her with a mix of curiosity and shyness. "Are you the lady who used to live with Grandma Ruth?" he asked. Maggie smiled gently. Not the sad smile she used to wear, not the polite one she gave at the grocery store. A real one. "No, honey," she said. "I'm her daughter." The boy nodded as if that explained everything and ran off toward the sidewalk, where his friends waited. Maggie leaned back in the chair, listening to the sound of children laughing and cicadas starting to hum. Inside the house, the light in the hallway clicked on with a soft buzz. The jasmine by the front door swayed in the breeze, and for the first time in her life, Maggie felt like she wasn't just existing in someone else's story. She was writing her own. As the porch faded into dusk, her voice echoed softly in her thoughts. Not bitter, not angry, just full of quiet resolve. Sometimes the truth waits a lifetime. But when it comes, it sets you free. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.